Our next principle of art is rhythm. Rhythm is repetition with variation. So rhythm is created when things are repeated in an artwork but also have variety. So adding variation, which means like having things change in some way, is what makes rhythm different from pattern. So patterns are predictable, they're the same over and over again, they're consistent, but rhythm is not predictable. With rhythm, things change. So even though we have repetition still happening, those things that repeat also change in some way. So, whatever it is that you repeat, whether it's lines, shapes, forms, etc., by changing the size of those lines, shapes, or forms, changing the width, or changing the placement, you create a sense of rhythm in an artwork. So, let's go ahead and look at this painting by Alexandra Exter. So Alexander Exter was a Russian Ukrainian artist who worked mostly in Europe during the turn of the 20th century, and she was a costume designer as well as a painter. And here in this painting, so this is theatrical composition done in 1925. So we can see that there's a lot of repeated elements in this painting. We definitely have repeated zigzag lines along here, but you can notice that those repeated zigzag lines also change in value, and that's what creates this sense of rhythm happening throughout this artwork. So like these stripes, they change in color. These ones over here also change in color. We have this archway, which also echoes this archway, but they change in shape. And then these arches back here also change in size. So they go from small to getting taller and taller, and they change in value and color as well. So we can compare those elements of the artwork, those parts that definitely create rhythm, with some of the parts of this artwork that also have pattern. For example, this part here in the middle is definitely a striped pattern. It's really consistent. It goes from light to dark. It's the same color throughout. And we could imagine that if this pattern were allowed to continue, it would probably be consistent and predictable throughout that whole pattern. But if we looked again at these arches back here, we're not really sure if this was to continue, how tall this next arch might be, right? Or what value that would be. Would it get lighter? Would it get darker? Would it be a completely different um, type of pink, right? So that's what makes that create rhythm in an artwork. Another example of rhythm, and this is a photograph by Bruce Baum, and this is a photograph of underneath the Santa Monica Pier. It's called Beneath Santa Monica Pier. So Bruce Barnbaum is an American contemporary photographer, and he specifically focuses on black and white photography mainly, and of landscapes and nature and buildings that depict lots of different textures and different values. So here we have this sense of rhythm from these repeated columns throughout. This is underneath a pier, right? So these are holding up the pier. So each of these columns they're clearly repeated over and over again, but they are each unique because, and we see this in nature all the time, but they have this growth happening on the base of them, right? Where the ocean comes in and it starts eroding part of these columns. And so because of that variety that's been added to our repeated elements, we have this sense of rhythm. We have the sense that there is this kind of coming and going, this back and forth happening throughout this artwork. So in the columns here, that's definitely happening. We can also see that they get smaller and thinner as they get farther away, and that also creates rhythm because we're adding that sense of variety. And then we can also see in the ripples of the water and these lines that are created with the value of the water and the way that the light hits and reflects on the water. We can see these lines are mostly parallel, but they also change. They change a little bit in the way as they go across the photograph here. So we can see that some of them start to slant downward, and some of them are mostly parallel, and some of them have some texture in them. So that sense of variety added to this artwork really allows us to see kind of like a pulsing rhythm. And we can think of rhythm when we compare it to music, right? So we're talking about rhythm in visual art and how you can create this rhythmic um, sort of pulse in as a visual, but often we think of rhythm with music, right? So if we can think of a pattern as like a consistent beat in music where it just stays the same throughout a whole song, and the rhythm is the thing that changes. It adds to the melody, it still repeats, it goes back to it, but it has that variation in it and becomes a lot more fluid and organic. And is what makes a song really interesting and impactful. So, same with our artwork. We want to add variety, we want to have nuance in what we see. Especially when we are depicting the natural world, because this is already happening in nature. If you look at a forest, there's lots of trees repeated, but every single tree is different. Every tree is unique. So it's only really when we start to see things that are maybe more man-made or more rigid in some ways that we get the rigidity of pattern. Like for example, these stripes here are kind of patterns that are in this composition because these are all definitely parallel. And of course, that's the top of this pier, right underneath this pier. All right, well, that is rhythm.